like to welcome Ray Kraut to the 4th legendary Luthiers event at the Acoustic Music Company in Brighton, England. Hand over to you, Ray.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for showing up to this tonight. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk to you guys a bit about my guitars, and thank you to Trevor for opening up his shop to all of us to hear more about them, and to play them, of course. But as Trevor said, my name is Ray Kraut. I've been building guitars now for over 10 years, which is hard to believe because that time went by so quickly. Especially my time with Irvin and starting the business in Oregon and still working there today. But this type of work keeps us so busy that it, time flies by very quickly. And so this year, Irvin and I have been getting together and talking about our 10-year anniversary with each other and sharing some fond moments and sharing memories and all that. And of course, we had a great time at Woodstock, which was last weekend, and all the apprentices getting together is always a fun thing because we all come from different walks of life, and we are a very small family, and it is just that. It's a family, and so it's fun to get together with those guys and just catch up on everything and see who's doing what and who's going where and all that. And while I'm here, I was thinking of things that I could bring to show you guys that represent some important things in my career. And I brought with me this little weird wooden cube that you might be sitting next to me wondering why is that sitting on the table over there. But this cube represents everything that has gotten me to where I am today and is one of the most important things that I carry around in my life. Starting Irvin's apprenticeship, the first thing that he has you do as an applicant is make a cube. Using nothing but hand tools, we have to make a perfect cube. And knowing this in advance, it seemed, oh, we got to make a cube. How hard can this be, right? 8 hours later, still trying to work on this thing, I ended up making a cube. But to this date, it was the hardest woodworking exercise I've ever had to do. And 10 years looking back, I look at this cube, and it takes me back to where I was. And it was a very interesting time, and it's something I cherish and hold on to. So because everybody likes to pass things around and check things out, I must admit, over 10 years, this thing has been held a lot. So there's all sorts of marks, and I swear you could shave with this thing when I was done with it. But I'll pass it along just so people can take a look at it. But what he does is he just grabs generally speaking, a neck cut off, a piece that's just sitting around the side of the shop or whatever kind of scrap piece of mahogany that he has. This one, for some mysterious reason, has 4 holes in it. I swear, I did not put those holes in it for the sake of making a cube, but it does happen to be there. So it may not look that interesting to everybody, but this actually represents a lot in the life of an apprentice with Irvin Samaji. So if you want to take a look at it, just pass it around. So there are 4 main reasons of what got me to where I am today. And one of which is the fact that I like to experiment. I was telling a few of you earlier that there are 2 different kinds of guitar builders that are out there, the legacy builders and the ones that try to evolve the guitar into something more. I belong to the experimental camp. And it's not in the essence of what a guitar sounds like, because to me, what Samaji has done for the guitars is what I consider one of the best sounding guitars that you can make. And so I'm very happy being in that camp. But as far as experimental goes, it's more of taking what Samaji taught me and how he constructs a guitar and then moving it forward into what we can sorry, I'm distracted by the cube now. And moving it forward in ways that can be more comfortable, lighter weight. So yeah, I like to experiment. I'm open to change. I see opportunity, and I value the relationships that I've had throughout my career. When it comes to, when I say I like to experiment with a guitar, I'm going to give you guys some examples. Irvin's guitar and how he makes them today is what I feel is to be a little bit heavier of an instrument. And being a player before I was a builder, I liked very lightweight instruments. And so the first thing that I attached to making a lighter weight guitar actually solved another thing that I wanted to move forward with my instruments. Now, if I was to say Irvin uses the Sloan method for a neck joint, does anybody actually know what that means? I see a few nods, and mostly not. Most people don't know what that is. And if I can move Linda Manzier's masterful drawing, which is much better than what I can draw of a guitar, I'll give you an example as to what that looks like. That really is quite good, by the way. I could not have done better than that. So a lot of us know what, say, like a dovetail neck joint looks like. We've all heard it before. It's in Martin's past, and that's how they've been building guitars and then bolt-on instruments. If I'm to, at an angle, try to draw a guitar here, please don't laugh. Okay, that was much better than I thought I was actually going to do. The Sloan method is basically a mortise and tenon. And when you attach the guitar to the body, there's no bolts that are holding this thing together. And so what you end up doing is taking and drilling 2 holes, half in between the head block and the other half being inside of the tenon itself, and putting dowel rods through it, locking the neck into place. And so it's a very effective way to put the guitar and have the neck stay on the body. The only problem is that we can't take those necks off in the future. And most of us know at this point that in some time in our lifetimes and how we build an instrument, a guitar is going to need a neck reset. And so there's lots of things that people have tried to do to maybe prevent it. And the Sloan method, what they do is they build a rather large head block. And building something large also means adding mass, adding a lot of extra weight. And so that was the first thing that I wanted to tackle when I started building my guitar. So I started using dovetails. And by doing that, I was able to reduce the head block size by half, which for a guitar right there at the center point, that makes a really drastic difference. And so just with dealing with one part of the guitar, I was able to really reduce the weight of an instrument, but still not affect the tone of the guitar. Another example is laminated sides. Irvin's been laminating sides now for a couple of decades. And there's been multiple iterations of how the sides, or the process of how you laminate those sides. And sometimes we would use the same wood as what's on the outside of the guitar, whether that's a rosewood, whether that's a maple or koa, or what have you. But really it doesn't matter. What really matters most on the sound of a guitar is the top and the back. The sides just want to be rigid. And so one of the things you'll notice, even on the koa guitar, there it is if you look inside of there, on the interior laminate is made out of Port Orford cedar. And Port Orford cedar is a very stable, very lightweight wood. And so using that on the sides rather than using a more dense wood, again, plays an impact on how heavy, for that example, the guitar is. And again, without affecting the tone of the instrument. I have made bolt-on instruments, and it's been one of the more recent things that I've done in my career, is I wanted to make an elevated fingerboard guitar. And I wanted to do that for multiple reasons. But one of the reasons was, just like I was saying before, removing a neck off of the body can be made really easily and without affecting the tone of an instrument. And an elevated fingerboard is really nice when it's achieved because it makes, you know, the gluing the fretboard onto this thing, it gets glued on flat. So rather than on every other guitar, when we put the neck joint on and then we have to actually compress the ebony fretboard down in the guitar body, you're creating a hump. And so by doing an elevated fingerboard, you have a flat surface the whole way. So the integrity of your fretboard stays more intact. That was a pretty good drawing, was it not?
No.
Who said that? But the other nice thing about it is that with an elevated fingerboard, nothing needs to get glued down on top of the guitar, and a neck can be just pulled off rather easily. And I was talking to a few of you earlier, is that I can't, you know, I'm a romantic at heart. And when I see a bolt when I'm walking through a store, I look at it and the quality of how it's made just makes me cry a little. And the idea of just putting a bolt in a guitar just takes away a lot of the romanticism about it for me. And so I see an opportunity to where I can make something and have it be aesthetically beautiful and integrate it into the design, but also find a material that's not, you know, a heavy metal. And that's when I started working with titanium. And so when I do a bolt-on style elevated fingerboard, it uses 2 titanium bolts that go in through the head block that attach the tenon onto the body, and then a small thumb screw that goes in under the fretboard extension over the guitar body. And I can take one of those necks off. If the strings aren't on, I can take one of those necks off in 3 minutes. It's very easy to do. So for a guitar and its longevity and for repairability and for anything that comes down the road, there are options here which make everyone's life easier and a little bit cheaper for that matter. Another thing that I was working on, it was probably a couple years ago, was dealing with arm bevels on guitars. And the principle of guitar tops and how they sound is they're like a drum. You know, you have rigid sides, 2 thin membranes on the top and the bottom. And so when it comes to putting an arm bevel on a guitar, I've been against it. And the reason for it is that you have a round surface area, and now you're going to take something and build into it. And so effectively what you're doing is you're taking something round that wants to, you know, physically move up and down, and you just put this like weird thing on it. It's essentially like putting your palm on the edge of a drum while you're trying to hit it. Imagine the way that changes the tone of that drum. So I had a customer that was really intent. He had to have an arm bevel. And so I designed one that was very subtle in nature. It was enough to give a lot of relief on the arm, which is something I've heard a lot of you in the audience talk about how dreadnoughts are big. And we have things like the Manzir wedge that came out, which adds a little more comfort, but it tilts the guitar body a little. And really an arm bevel is a comfortable answer to making bigger body guitars more comfortable. And so what I ended up doing was just making a very small version of it and having it still have the comfort just without the big artisticness of it. You know, there's a lot of things that happen in the guitar world that happen very largely to make them expressive and have a big visual component. But typically it's beyond what is necessary to make a comfortable need to have on an instrument. So those are just some examples of things that I like to experiment with to kind of push back from where Samaji started and how I'm evolving the guitar into what I consider like a 21st century guitar. And again, if you have questions, please feel free to. Yes, Dave.
Dave, question between the different types of neck joints
Yes.
you've used. Have you noticed any difference in the kind of sustain of the instrument?
You know, I haven't, because all of the different neck joints that we're using have solid connections onto the guitar body. So the energy that the neck is picking up from the strings is still being transferred through to the body. You know, I sat around after I did this. I was curious myself, being not always interested in doing a bolt-on instrument, wondering, you know, what's that going to do for the tone of the instrument? So naturally, when I decided to finally make one, I was very curious myself to see if there was going to be any kind of tonal implications, whether it was sustained, anything else. And being it with another guitar that I had, myself, a couple other musicians, we had a group. We couldn't hear any difference between the bolt-on neck versus the dovetail. But that's a good question.
Would you say it's more the execution of it rather than the type of joint? Yeah, it's well executed.
Well, yes. Certainly, a bolt-on guitar which has a lot of area that is not transmitting into the guitar body now you're going to be losing something. So it is important to pay attention to it. So even when I say I make an elevated fingerboard, one might think that half of the fingerboard is sticking out, hovering over the guitar, but it's not. One of the ways that I've developed it was, rather than having the neck project pretty far up the guitar body and then having a negative neck angle down towards the bridge, I've kept the neck angle the same and simply recessed it into the head block of the guitar. And so by the time I put that little thumb screw that I mentioned in there, I'm locking the whole thing together. It's touching, it's just not glued together. So you have the same amount of transmission for the energy to get through to. Yes?
I'd be interested to know how you evaluate the sound of your guitars. You were talking then about doing comparisons.
Mm-hmm.
It's done as a listening panel?
It is.
Or is it done, do you use any kind of instrumentation? Electronic instruments, miking? Or
Both. So one of the things we did when I was at Irvin's, and to be honest, I hadn't thought about this until you mentioned it, is, so Irvin lives in a busy part of the world. Lots of traffic, lots of ambient noise. And there was often a time where Michi Matsuda would come by with a guitar, and Irvin would have one of his guitars, and I would have one of my apprentice model guitars, and maybe Lewis had a guitar that he wanted to bring in. And so we'd have these group of guitars, and we always wanted to listen, evaluate, understand what made one thing do this and the other do that. And one of the more fascinating things to do was to have a listening panel, because we all hear things differently. Nothing is the same. And even the way we hear things cut through ambient noise is different than what we can hear from just sitting in a room like this where it's nice and quiet. So we would do just that. We would go outside, and typically Irvin would play on his front porch, and we'd sit across the street. Because we wanted to hear it. It's like, what cuts through the crowd? What cuts through all this crazy traffic that's coming through there? I mean, most of the people driving by probably thought we were nuts. I don't know. We were sitting on the ground with our backs to Irvin, listening to what he was doing, because it was a blind panel. We didn't, not always, we were testing to see what we could hear without being biased towards which guitar it happened to be. But nowadays, I still do that with some very close friends of mine in the Bay Area, musicians that I work with, and good friends classical guitarists, and people who come from different areas. One of them's an electric guitar player. He hears one thing. More likely, with how loud they play their music, they probably don't hear as much as they used to. And we sit around in a panel and we evaluate the instrument. And I don't do it with all of my instruments, but when I do something like an elevated fingerboard, and especially the first one that I did, we did this with them. And a good friend of mine named Don Latarski, who you might have seen from videos on my website, has all sorts of recording equipment, and one of his favorite pastimes is to record my guitars and digitally look at what's happening on the inside of the guitar when it's being played. And so when we get these graphs of what the guitar looks like from a digital perspective, and you compare, say my double low model that has a dovetail neck joint with a double low model that has an elevated fingerboard, they look remarkably similar, even when they're different woods. No. Good question. Any other neck joint questions?
So you talk about your elevated fingerboards.
Yeah.
You're keeping still the same rank.
Mm-hmm.
So how high are your fingerboards? You're sitting them in to keep the same height, wasn't it?
Yeah. So first off, I should say a little bit about how my head blocks are constructed. Head blocks on my guitar are not standard. In a Samaji-esque fashion of building is something you'll find in all of these, is it's more of an L shape. So it's the block coming up that supports the tenon, the dovetail, whichever, and then it ramps over onto the top. So there's about a 3/4 to 5/8 thick piece of wood that's actually underneath where the fretboard is typically glued down. And it goes all the way up to the transverse brace. And so that's giving support that's underneath the top. And so what I do with my elevated fingerboards is I build my head blocks a little bit differently so that I can actually route a pocket in the guitar body itself, so that rather than the neck, which has to have the neck go under the fretboard extension, which is usually not there, elevated, I'm able to recess that into the guitar body itself so as to keep it the same. The idea of the elevated fingerboard isn't necessarily a design concept that you should get it because ooh and ah, it looks amazing. It's more of a functional piece. And there's a lot of things that you can gain by having it and not take away from the tone of the guitar. And that's an important thing actually to discuss too is, you know, everybody, all the different luthiers that are out there, we all have the same goal. We want to make great sounding guitars that are comfortable and easy to play. Others of us, you know, we all have different design ideas in our head. And for someone like myself, there's a line that, you know, you draw in the sand where I'm not going to cross taking design as being more important than the sound of my guitars. And there are certain design elements that, of course, you know, I could do all sorts of crazy stuff with the shape and look of a guitar, but that's going to affect the tone. And when it comes to something like an elevated fingerboard, I'm not going to put it on one of my guitars just because it makes, say, my life easier 50 years down the road. I'm going to do it because, and the fact that it might have some kind of tone change, I'm going to do it and make sure it won't change the tone and still have that function later on. Did that answer your question?
So I think perhaps I've misunderstood. So this is not an elevated finger in order to free up the upper bout of the front to resonate.
Mm-mm.
No, it's a different.
No, because none of the guitars that are built the way that these are built are going to vibrate up there anyways because of how the head block is constructed and how we form the inner part of the instrument. And the way. Let me grab a different color here, if I can get it. That is my drum. That is what I am most concerned about. This is the area, from a physics standpoint, that is moving, that is creating the energy that I want to produce the sound of my guitars. Anything that happens north of here is less of a concern. That, for me, is an air cavity. So that helps produce the volume and how big the guitar sounds, like a dreadnought versus a 00. Guitar bodies, air mass is really important. But the top, the soundboard part of the guitar, it's this circle here that I'm most concerned about, not what's vibrating and happening up here.
Right? Where's your sound hole relative to that drum?
You're going to make me draw that in here. You know, approximately. That's, I mean, more specifically from the top of the instrument to the center of the sound hole is 6 inches, if that helps. But basically, the diaphragm that I care about moving is basically right at the bottom of the sound hole. Did that help?
But they must be dynamically connected in some way, that they aren't completely independent because it's one piece of wood.
No, but this is when it comes down to voicing an instrument. I mean, this is where bracing patterns are important. This is how manipulating the braces underneath of a guitar can dictate how that top is going to move. And we all voice guitars differently. Again, I am in the camp of having these optimally responsive instruments, and the part that I want it to move is that. And from what Irvin teaches is that's your golden area. That's what you need to focus on.
Obviously, I understand that. It's the relationship between the bit that doesn't vibrate and the bit that does vibrate. They are connected.
Oh, they absolutely are connected, yes.
Yeah, exactly, yes.
And so it is doing something, but it's not, you know, it doesn't dictate whether, you know, as far as an elevated fingerboard is concerned, I'm not worried about the 0.5% of something that might be happening up there versus not having that. It's really maybe something my border collie can notice the difference on. But.
I've never played one, but there are classical guitar makers who make quite a thing of lifting fingerboard off.
Yeah,
It's
and
something different
I'm
about it. It's just-
I've spoken with a couple people, and again, we all have our different theories as to what makes a guitar sound optimal. And a very good friend of mine and a very excellent classical guitar builder, Jeffrey Elliott, happens to do a bracing design where he focuses on making the upper bout of the guitar move. I mean, he sends interesting bridge designs in the braces that send other braces through so that energy can get in there. And myself, Irvin, and other people have explored going down that road, but it hasn't really proved to have anything exceptionally different about it that makes it worthwhile. And the big difference between steel string and nylon string instruments is a lot of string pressure. And so one of the things that we have to work with is the idea of, as Irvin would say, building on the cusp of disaster. You have to build it strong enough to hold up to this string tension. It's not about just what makes the top move and sound to its optimal rate, but it has to hold up to approximately 180 pounds of string tension. And that's a difficult line to play.
Yeah.
Because of the way that I'm structured, I need to have a wide neck, and I need to have actually pretty wide spacing of the saddle. And I found that some of the best guitars I've played obviously suit me physically. But to me, there seems to be, I'm just wondering whether you have any thoughts on whether, it seems to me that a note separation generally improves, and classical guitars is a great example of that. They tend to have a much wider nut width and a wider saddle width than, say, a traditional Martin, for example. I just wonder whether there's any, whether that's just a myth or whether it's just wishful thinking or whatever.
Well, perhaps there's a little bit of both in there.
Okay.
More and more often, as steel string builders, we are going with wider nuts, and not necessarily wider saddle spacing. That we usually do more for comfort reasons. But the wider you build a neck does have a difference on the tone of an instrument. It doesn't mean it gets better or it gets worse. It just perhaps changes things a little bit for the player. And
Well, it changes it for me, so I'm not universally hitting strings I shouldn't be.
right. And there's that. Far less buzzing when.
Right, could you show us your guitar and explain a little bit of the history of the modified dreadnought?
Sure. Well, history of the modified dreadnought. Well, I built 3 models of guitar. I'll start off this way. A 00 model, an OM model, and a modified dreadnought model. And during my apprenticeship with Irvin, and along with other apprentices, Irvin likes the idea of us using his guitar shapes. It helps to, move forward his legacy. And Irvin has gone to great extents to design guitars that are aesthetically beautiful and very comfortable to play. Now, myself personally, my modified dreadnought model is the only model that I make that is carried on from Irvin. So this is essentially an Irvin Samaji designed modified dreadnought. And when you say modified dreadnought, simply all that means is that it's modified from a Martin. And the only thing that is different on this instrument, well, there's lots of things different on this instrument, but as far as the shape of the guitar is concerned, is the cutaway. That is my own. Dreadnoughts are famous for their big sound, and they are ever popular to build. My focus when I was coming out of my apprenticeship was to build small body instruments, because that's what I played myself. And that is the reason why on my OM and my 00 model, I designed them specifically around how I feel those guitars should look, feel when you're playing them, and just look aesthetically beautiful. But I'm biased. But this modified dreadnought is made of a Koa back and sides and a bear claw Sitka top. As I mentioned before, the interior laminates of this, when all my guitars have laminated sides, is made of Port Orford cedar. And the tuners on these guitars are made from a guy in Italy named Niccolo Alessi. Hand-built tuners, and it's what comes standard on my instruments. Nothing against other factory-built tuners that work and function perfectly fine. I've always felt, and it kind of goes back to the bolts that I put in an instrument if I do a bolt on, they need to represent the quality of the instrument that you're building. And I have a hard time putting on a factory-built anything onto one of my guitars. I've been working with Niccolo now for 10 years. And one of the things I love most about him is the fact that every time I order another set of tuners from him, it comes a little bit different. So like myself in building guitars, he's constantly pushing himself either in design or functionality to move the tuner into another era. And I hope I always have an opportunity to buy his tuners. One of these days I'll have to buy a large stock of them. The guitar scale length is 25 1/4, which is standard on my dreadnoughts. Nut width is 1 25/32, so slightly wider than 1 3/4, which was the old standard, and Martin nut width, which is even smaller than that. These days, being able to have that extra string spacing on the fingerboard is really essential to playing. What else can I tell you about this instrument? It's got ebony binding and it's a powerhouse. Does anyone have any questions on the guitar itself? David,
Yeah, a question about the nut on your guitars. I noticed it's scalloped.
Yeah.
Is that purely an aesthetic thing, or is it done for a tonal? Because I've noticed that Irving does that.
Yeah, and I could give you a whole long side of how it focuses the energy down into the nut, which brings more down into the guitar body. But in reality, it's an aesthetic touch. You know, once you see one that's like this, it's hard to look at another nut and be satisfied. Go ahead.
I have a general question about the cutaway.
Yeah.
So, the loss of air volume,
Mm-hmm.
what impact does that have? Do you need to, what else do you modify to offset that?
That is a good question, and it's something that I am concerned about, which is why, if anybody noticed, I've never built a 00 that has a cutaway. And the reason for that is because I don't want to take that air mass away from the guitar body. Because that does play a role in the tone. It takes away from the volume, it takes away from every different characteristic of the tone. On a guitar body like a dreadnought, you have room to spare, so it's hard to say you're missing anything when you take you put a cutaway on the instrument. Yes?
I was just going to, it's an interesting question there, but your drawing of the circle there, the most important part of the soundboard, clearly doesn't include any part of the soundboard that would incorporate the cutaway.
Right.
Right, so what I'm trying to say is that if that's the most important area to concentrate on in terms of sound generation, then the cutaway should have a minimal impact on...
Minimal, but you're thinking of the fact that the top needs to move up in that area. And we're not talking about the top being energetic at this point in time. It's really the air mass that you've taken out of the drum itself. Essentially, you've just taken a drum and shrunk it. And that's where the tonal difference comes into play, not the fact that you're missing any energy movement from the top itself. But that's a very common thought about cutaways. I hear it all the time, is they're afraid that it's going to take away from the energy of the top, when really it's not the case at all.
So it does make an impact then, having the cutaway?
It does, yeah.
Presumably it's the Helmholtz air resonance effect.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Do you compensate by, sorry, I didn't hear. Do you compensate by having a deeper body if you have a cutaway?
You can. It's another way to get the air mass back into the instrument. Again, when you play and most of you have had an opportunity to play this guitar, it's not lacking. It doesn't, we're not afraid of it needing more volume or expressing something a little more. And so we don't change it because it's such a big body in the first place. Adding more depth to it would add more to the fact that it would be deeper and harder on the arm in the first place. So you can adjust things with, let's say, if you added a man's ear wedge. But again, it plays a role in the comfort of the instrument. I recently built a modified dreadnought for Burt Lamb's of the California Guitar Trio. And he wanted something very different in the depth of an instrument. Basically, it's incredibly shallow. And up at the upper bout of the instrument is only maybe 2 inches thick. But the bottom half is about 4 inches thick. Don't know the number off the top of my head, but it was a strong man's ear wedge. But it was about half the air mass of what a dreadnought typically has. And for him, it's a different set of circumstances because he's up on stage playing for his career. And rarely will he ever play that guitar unplugged. So for him, he needed enough to where it sounded distinctly like a dreadnought, so it amplifies okay, but has more comfort because he plays every day. He's on tour every day. He's recording with this. He's, so comfort trumped having the bigger air mass inside of it. But again, with a dreadnought, you have so much to begin with that you can take away half and it's still a humongous guitar.
Yeah, your choice of woods, do you have in your mind's ear how you think it's going to sound by your choice of woods?
Mostly when it comes to back and sides. The density properties of the back and sides are what generally play a role as to what an instrument is going to be slightly different from. Because as the tops are graded in the way that we do these, build these instruments, is that we base them all off of stiffness to weight ratios. And so you can take a set of Sitka, a set of Engelmann, European spruce, Adirondack, anything, and if you get the weight and the stiffness to weight ratios all the same, they all produce the exact same sounding instrument. The reason why a lot of people have these, and I'm talking everybody, and Irvin is, he's been pushing this for years and years and years, and we've done a lot of experimentation with it. The reason why everyone tends to have a different opinion of, say, what Sitka sounds like or what Engelmann sounds like in European is because the majority of those woods have general characteristics. And so when they're put out in the masses and people don't grade them the same way that we do, yeah, they sound really different from one another. But if you find a set of Engelmann and a set of Sitka spruce that have the exact same properties, the energy moves through them exactly the same way and ends up producing the same sounding instrument. So when I think about a guitar that's going to sound a little bit different, I'm not actually thinking about what the top wood's going to be, because I know how to voice that to make the type of guitars that I'm going to do. I'm wondering what is it going to be coupled to that is going to respond to the energy that I'm giving it from the top.
So you had that's Koa, so you had an idea what that may sound like?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, experience does that for you.
And you chose Koa over, say, rosewood or...
Well, half the time when you build a guitar, the client already has in mind what kind of wood that they want. And if they tell me they want a specific sound that I know isn't going to come from the set of wood that they've chosen or what they're interested in, then I'm going to recommend them maybe to a different route. But for the most part, people, when it came to building this instrument, Trevor approached me and said, "I'd love to have a Koa instrument." So I said, "Okay." But yeah, I knew what it was going to come out sounding like in general. And Koa is one of those interesting woods. It's one of my favorite because it blends the things that I love the most. I happen to just absolutely be in love with mahogany guitars, and I have been since I was a kid. At this point, maybe it's fairly nostalgic, or who knows what. But I love mahogany guitars, but that's not to take away at all from rosewoods. And koa is this beautiful, in the middle, it has qualities of what I like about both mahogany and both rosewoods. And the grain structure in a koa is a lot like a mahogany. In fact, if we were to look it up, I'm sure somewhere deep rooted in there, you'll find that they are from a similar family of tree, despite the ocean between them. But that's a good question.
Do you do cedar tops, or is it just always spruce?
I have done cedar and redwood tops, and when I was, those do make a different tone. And the reason I say that is because you can't find those things in the same realm as what we search for to build tops like this. And not too many people want those anymore, from what I can tell. The most popular top that I end up using is European spruce. And the trouble with European spruce is it's become very difficult, at least in the United States, to source good European spruce. And earlier this year, I had to fly to Italy and source it in person, and which was absolute fun. That wasn't a bad part of my, renting a car and driving up into the mountains and having a friendly gentleman who speaks no English at all make you the best carbonara of your life was certainly a highlight for me. But also sourcing through all this spruce and getting to see it hands-on, be tactile with it. A lot of woods on instruments these days, you have to buy sight unseen. And that's really difficult for a luthier because so much of what we do is physical. And feeling the piece of wood and hearing it and seeing how the stiffness, across the grain on, say, a guitar top, it's something that you have to do in person. You try to describe that to somebody, and not once in 10 years have I ever had anyone give me what I had asked for. So it's become very difficult. And the supplies here in the US, because of the popularity of guitar building these days, it's a first come, first serve, and you've got to get down there fast to get it. So yeah, flying to Italy is how I was able to, not this particular top, but most of my other tops, which are European spruce, that's how I have to get them these days. But redwood and cedar, I love to work with them when I can because they are incredibly stiff and they are very lightweight. But it's European spruce and Sitka spruce, that's where the market is in the instruments these days, so that's what we have to build.
Right, there seems to be a common perception that Sitka is the sort of cheap wood used on mass-produced guitars. How do you feel about it?
Well, it's a great question because Sitka's a fabulous wood, and a lot of woods will get a bad rap because, say for example, it comes free with the guitar. There's no upcharge to get Sitka spruce. That has nothing to do with the quality of the wood, but it's about sourcing it and the availability of it. And I have to fly to Europe to get a piece of European spruce. Yeah, it's going to cost a little more. And Sitka is one of these amazing woods where I often tell people about searching for guitar tops and getting back to the fact that if you source the right one out of each one of these piles, they will all sound the same. Is if you had a pallet of Sitka spruce sitting in front of you with 100 tops on it, I could go through there and I could say with absolute certainty that 90% of them have exactly what I want out of a guitar top. 90%, that's extraordinary in today's world. If I had a pallet of European spruce sitting in front of me with 100 tops on it, I could say that maybe 30 to 35%, if that anymore, because it's been going down because the quality of the trees they're just not as big anymore. But it would be about that. And if I was to go down to Engelmann, it goes down to about 15%. And So it becomes very interesting, and Sitka spruce is an amazing wood, but the reason that its value comes with the instrument is because, I mean, if I did buy something sight unseen, I'd be pretty confident buying a set of Sitka spruce. Especially with bear claw like this.
So tell me about bear claw, because on the face of it, it looks like, I mean, it's beautiful, but it does look like a defect in the grain. It's a curl in the grain. Does that not affect the stiffness?
Not a bit. It's a very interesting feature I have on the top. I happen to love it. I first got introduced to it at Irvin's. He worked a lot with it, especially on his chip carved instruments. And I remember asking him that question a long time ago, and only thing he said to me is, no. You know, the figure in this wood changes so quickly. When you cut a piece of wood, even with a very small curved bandsaw blade, when you open it up to book match it, the grain's all perfect, but the figure can vary pretty radically inside of it. So the figure that's in it is moving around so much, but it doesn't ever tend to affect the stiffness of the top itself. Unlike, say, for example, stump wood, or a lot of other figured woods, you know, say for a back and sides, you know, where when you cut into those, it's very common. You book match them up, they look a perfect mirror image. But that grain is really doing something incredibly crazy, and it can be unstable. So unlike those other figured woods, bear claw has never seemed to have any adverse effect. Okay. Have you ever found anything different?
I have not had a lot of luck with bear claw.
How so?
I don't know why, but I've made 2 instruments with bear claw fronts, and I haven't particularly liked either of them.
Oh dear. From a tonal aspect. Well,
From a tonal, yeah, absolutely.
yeah. Well, you know, and that's a big question. You know, that's a big thing to evaluate, because there are so many things involved in a guitar that has to do with the tone of an instrument. Yeah.
Here we've got guitar owned by somebody present here, from Jason Costa. And many may have heard of the sad passing of Gustav Fredel. This is an absolutely stunning guitar by Gustav. This is a guitar by recently graduated Leo Buendia, another Mod D in maple this time. This one by the man himself, curly maple instead of bird's eye maple, and that's J from 1979, recently revoiced. And the one and only Skunk from Michi Matsuda, an African blackwood.
Right, basically what I want to do is just show off the guitar rather than my guitar skills, you understand, okay? Because I'm in love with this guitar, and I want it.
Terribly like it, pretty cool, so.
nice deep resonance, but it's still clear. Some guitars, if you drop it into, this is a low C by the way, into a low C tuning, they just flap about and buzz. But it's all there. I like fat tones in the treble. It's there. Look at that. It's not thin at all.
Well, I'd love to just sit up here and answer more of your questions. For those of you who have questions on the guitars or the construction itself, that's what I'm here for.
I just wondered if you had a preference about strings and gauge and makes and things.
Oh, how much time do we have, Trevor?
And on that subject, people who use quite extreme tunings, I mean, this business of that's presumably a standard set, and yet dropping the bottom E down to C is fairly radical.
The brand of strings that I've been most impressed with, and I'll tell you that a lot of this has changed over the years, but that's mainly because string manufacturers keep continuing to change things over the years. Clearly the dog doesn't agree with me. I use John Pierce to answer the question quickly. And sets vary for people for a lot of different reasons. And even though I prefer the tone of John Pierce myself, personally, I never tend to play with them. But that's just because of the makeup of my hands. I will kill a set of strings in seconds. It's remarkably unfortunate. So I hate to have to admit this, but I do, for my own personal playing, have to use coated strings. Unless I feel like changing strings every 5 minutes, and I do enough of that during the day anyways, I don't want to do it again.
Because of the same reason.
Yeah.
Is that the same for all your guitars?
What's that?
All models?
The brand of string?
Yeah.
Yes. Unless, of course, somebody asks for something specific. I mean, it's fairly regularly that somebody says, I use these gauges of this brand, and oftentimes they even send me the strings that they like to use because it might be a custom set. In which case I set the guitar specifically for using those types of strings. But all of my guitars are built to withstand medium gauge strings, as that is my particular preference for strings. And for a lot of the reasons you mentioned, I like a meaty treble sound.
Yeah.
And
so what was that playing?
13th.
13th.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, quite easy.
Yeah, and
13s I usually find a bit heavy, but
yeah. So I've experimented with just about every different string manufacturer out there, and a phosphor bronze John Pierce string currently has my heart.
It lasts about 10 minutes.
Well, for me personally, yes. And it's unfortunate because for many other people, they last for a really long time. But they made coated strings because I exist in the world. I support their business regularly. But unfortunately, the more you coat a string, the more it dampens the tone.
If you built basically the same guitar from, let's say, Indian rosewood or Macasset ebony or maple, like Leo's guitar there, how would the tone change on that?
Well, the tone is based off of the density, really, of the wood itself. Whether it's going to be a reflective wood, so maybe it has more volume, or a wood that is softer that tends to absorb energy rather than reflect it. So maples tend to absorb it, so they end up being a warmer tone. And I should say that most people who have played maple guitars think that they know what a maple guitar sounds like. But until you've played a maple guitar that is built the way that I and my peers build maple guitars, you really haven't heard it yet. And it's really exceptional. And I just got back from the Woodstock show. I shouldn't say I haven't gotten back, because I haven't gotten home yet. It just feels like home here. There's good beer, so it feels like home. But one of the comments that I receive over and over and over and over and again is that people didn't know maple could sound like this. And so, I mean, Leo's guitar is a prime example, and so is, of course, the Samaji sitting right next to it. It's probably not what you expect to come out of a maple guitar. So yeah, it has everything to do with the density. And so this is when I was saying earlier, if somebody says they wanted a guitar and they want this wood out of it and they want it to sound like so-and-so, if they happen to say that it's a wood and want this particular tone with it, if I don't think it's going to hit the mark, then I'm going to say something to them. And you know, most of the time they don't listen to me anyways, they just get what they want.
Samaji talks about woods having a vitreous quality, and maple absolutely doesn't. Yet it can still sound extremely good, I agree with you.
Yeah.
So clearly, that's not the whole story then.
It's not the whole story. I mean, every piece of wood is unique, and just like how we grade a top, you need to grade back and sides too. The guitar that I brought to Woodstock was a set of European quilted bird's eye maple. And I wasn't intending to find this piece of wood, but I happened to have been in Italy sourcing spruce, and I came across this person who had this extraordinary, I've never seen maple like it in my life. So of course I had to get some of it, and he didn't want to sell it to me. He was a builder himself, and that was a part of his inventory. And I'm not surprised. I would say the same thing if somebody tried to buy it from me. But I ended up getting it from him. It was a very interesting set of maple that, if I was to describe the density, I'd say it's a little less than, say, hard rock maple, but not like Western big leaf maple. And the tone of it was just absolutely extraordinary. So there's a lot that goes on behind a piece of wood, but a lot of that is instinctual, or just what is in us that makes us know what's going to make a good guitar. It's not all physics for us all the time.
Yep.
Have you come across woods from particular years where the weather has changed?
Yes. Yes.
Are there particular years, like the wines of 1974?
Oh, right. Oregon Pinot, man. It's like, I want a 2012, not 11, right? And yeah, no, it can be. And for certain spruces, for example, yes and no. Again, when it comes to the Sitka, it's just so much of the stuff that's out there is just so amazing that I don't need to worry about what year that it came from. But there was a company that I went to in, let's see, it was in a tiny town of Anthals, I'm sure some of you will recognize it. It was Bachman Tone Woods. And I visited them, and it was very unique how they organized their wood, because it was all by year, the round of the tree, and the particular set number and how it was oriented when it was cut off the mill. And that is an exceptional way to do things because you can really learn a lot about how the particular years were grown and how it was over time, basically. So, and the grain tells everything, even more so than the particular year, because obviously the tree was, unlike grapes, harvested. And I mean, it lived more, through many, many decades of its life before it was harvested. And so that's the main thing I look for in a guitar top, is even growth cycles. And of course, that's going to come at higher elevation woods, which is why finding European spruce of that quality is becoming harder and harder to find, because there's really only so many, and they only grow so fast. It's unfortunate, really.
Could you say something about how you voice a soundboard? I mean, you've got the pieces of wood which are all individual, I know, so it's going to vary from top to top, but generally...
Well, not necessarily, because every top that we use, or that I use specifically on my tops, are graded the exact same way. So I'm starting off from the same point. Grading the braces is another big, thing that we have to work through. I tend to use Sitka spruce on my braces for the same reasons I mentioned why I love Sitka spruce for tops in the first place. It's very easy to find really great Sitka spruce, and it's very lightweight and it's very stiff. And what that allows me to do is to work more in the voicing process to get exactly what it is I want that top to do. Explaining to you how I voice a guitar gets very complicated. It's something that you have to hear more so than me tell you. And that's part of the process of an apprenticeship, is being able to sit down with Irvin while he's voicing an instrument and really get an understanding of it and have it ingrained in your mind what it is that every little thing does to the energy of the top. And it's really fascinating. But basically, to sum up like how I voice a top, is I am whittling away at those braces until that top is energized over a very small amount of energy that's put into it.
And it's on the
So, Ray,
limit.
how much of what you do is science and how much is art?
Wow.
How much magic?
I've never had to think about that before. But to be honest, it's probably 50-50. I mean, a lot of the science is already worked out on the guitar, so I know what's going to be happening in certain
So
things.
that's 50 art, 50 science, and 50 magic.
Yes. My guitars are 150%. It's really interesting. And I'll tell you a quick story about my apprenticeship with Irvin. And it was the first time that I saw him voicing a guitar. And there happened to be some other people in the shop at the time, and I didn't realize at the moment how important this was. But to see him take an approach on voicing a guitar, it was almost, and stay with me, but it was an out-of-body experience. I mean, he just went into some place, and it became incredibly spiritual in a way, to see the way that he operated and moved into it. And I didn't say anything. I sat in the corner and just watched him work, and it was really a thing of beauty. And once I started doing it myself, I understand this place that he goes into, and it's hard to call that science at a certain point, because really it's just this emotional response to doing something that you care so much about. And it's something about how I work with all of my guitars. But yes, of course, there's a science behind all this, but in the back of our minds, that's already ingrained in what we're going to be doing to the guitar. And more importantly, where not to go. Because we know where that line is of what makes an optimal sounding guitar and holds up to the tension of the steel strings. So that's a very complicated question, but my easy answer is 50-50-50.
It's a bit like when you're playing, you know when you're in the zone, don't you?
It is exactly what it is. So when it came to design on my guitars, I get asked why I do what I do. With the artwork. Why do I have to make a one-off every time I do it? And the reason is because there was when I went through my apprenticeship with Irvin, I had a little money saved up to try to get myself through it, but I had to do it on my own. And I had a city job before I decided to go through Roberta Venn and go into Irvin's apprenticeship. So I had some money saved up, but I was amazed how quickly I went through that money. And I told you I can drift really far into conversation, so I'm going to try to keep myself back. But I went through a lot of it very quickly because it was like when I came in there were so many things that I wanted to do differently that he wasn't jigged up for. So it wasn't just buying woods. I had to buy things to make dovetail neck joints and different router bits, because if I took one router bit out of one of his pre-set up laminate trimmers, I was in for it. He's got many of them, and they're all set up to do one specific thing. So rewinding back to the point that I was going to make, one of the beautiful things about the Bay Area is that the first Tuesday of every month, and this was 10 years ago, I assume they still do this to this day, but there's free admission into all the museums in the Bay Area. And that was a beautiful thing for me, because this was I was really interested in design and what it can do to your eye and what it can do to you just in your head, spiritually, emotionally, whatever it happens to be. But it's there and it's real and it makes an impact on us. And the first time I felt that was walking into the San Francisco MoMA and see an exhibit that was put on by Paul Klee. It was called Innocence and Insanity. And maybe that makes sense. I was a Luthier, so insanity probably sounds a little appropriate. But it hit me, and it hit me really hard, and I've never felt that before. And it was the first time where I sat back and said, man, art can really mess with you. You know, it can make an impact. And I sat there for hours just staring at this, you know, trying to figure out what it was specifically about this art that made me have this emotional reaction. And that's when I decided that I'm going to try to push this into my instruments. I was always interested in doing something that was unique every time, but I didn't realize I was going to focus so much on the idea of I want to inspire the musician. And because it changes the way you think. I'm sure every one of us has probably gone into a museum and had some kind of emotional reaction by seeing something that you may not know what it was, but it made a mark. It hit you. You stared at it trying to figure out, like, I really like that. You know, there's something about it, and it puts you in a place. And so I'm not saying I'm Paul Klee, but I strive to be. And it's one of my interests as an artist, not just a guitar builder, is to inspire the musician the way that these artists have inspired me to want to do it. And my hope is that people like yourself get inspired. Maybe it changes the way that you think about playing the guitar.
Yeah, just back to the subject of bracing. I noticed that you've made guitars with lattice brace backs. I noticed this one is a more, I say, conventional sort of ladder brace. Is there a particular reason for that, or
yes.
does it make it?
I originally started making lattice bracing guitars in Irvin's apprenticeship. And the reason why is that Irvin loves to test boundaries, and he wanted to continue to exceed the normal realms of what you would thickness a back to, let's just say. And it got really thin to the point where we needed to brace it more evenly throughout, not having so many gaps in between the structural supports. And so I took the same amount of mass that was in a ladder brace system, like the one that's on this guitar, and simply redistributed it over the back more evenly to give the back better support so that it wouldn't have an opportunity to warp or get manipulated in any way. That's where the lattice bracing came from. And for a long time, I kept that on all of my guitars up until about 2.5 years ago or so. And my reasoning for going back to the ladder bracing was Yeah, some people are just interested in just having a ladder brace system on their guitar. They don't quite understand the lattice, and so I've been playing with using them both. And I don't not build with lattice anymore. I happen to really like it. But what I've done is I've gone to a traditional ladder bracing on a guitar that its back and side woods have a lot of stiffness built into it. If it's a highly figured wood, that's when I start using a lattice brace system. Basically when it needs it. If a set of wood doesn't need it, if I'm not concerned about its structural integrity, then I will use a ladder brace system. If otherwise, I put one on. So for example, I never thought I would do this. I'm still shocked to hear it come out of my mouth, but I did my first Sunburst guitar. And it was on a set of tree mahogany. It was a 00. And I never thought I would find myself doing a Sunburst guitar, but when I saw pictures of it, I just kind of was like, well, you know, I really like the way that looks after all. So we did it, not on the top, just the back and sides. In any case, with the tree mahogany, of course, that's a highly figured wood, and that one had a lattice brace back on it.
Okay.
No,
Thank you, Ray.
one more.
What's that?
If you're going to build a guitar for yourself,
Oh, not
describe that
this.
guitar.
Well, I just did actually. That tree mahogany guitar that I built, it's going to a gentleman in Texas, really has my heart. I mentioned earlier that mahogany, it has me. And there's no particular rhyme or reason towards it, but it's just, I am very nostalgic towards mahoganies with a European spruce. And I cannot believe I'd say it, but I would totally put a Sunburst on it. I completely fell in love with that guitar.
So what body shape is that?
It's a 00. And 00s are my favorite model of instrument, but of course, that's me personally. I love small bodies. I was very excited to introduce the model last year, and I cannot believe how many 00s I'm now making these days. No. As soon as I put those out, I got a pretty good reputation for making small body instruments, and now that's a lot of what I build. So yes, and a slotted peg head, because I'm a traditionalist that way. Probably the only way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Ray.
You're welcome. Thank you guys.